Hello, everyone. My name is Min Jung Kim, and I'm the director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art, one of, if not the oldest museums dedicated exclusively to American art. I'm delighted to welcome you today for a fascinating lecture by Dr. Allison K. Lange on her new book, Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement. This program accompanies our current exhibition, Someday is Now, Women, Art, and Social Change, which recently opened on October 1st. Marking the centennial of women's suffrage in America, the exhibition features the work of female identifying artists whose work advocates for women's empowerment and social justice. Including historic ephemera from the women's suffrage movement, the exhibition explores the visual strategies that have been employed in the last century by activists and artists to spread messages of social change. Someday is Now is part of the museum's major initiative that launched this year entitled 2020, 20 Plus Women at the NBMAA, celebrating 100 years of women's right to vote. We have devoted all of our exhibition programming throughout 2020 and 2021 to women artists. We are tremendously grateful to our presenting sponsors, Stanley Black & Decker, with additional support provided by Bank of America. Without further ado, I am honored to introduce Dr. Allison K. Lange, who is an associate professor of art history at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. She received her PhD in history from Brandeis University, and Lange's book, Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement, was published in May 2020 by the University of Chicago Press. The book focuses on the ways in which women's rights activists and their opponents used images to define gender and power during the suffrage movement. Her writing has appeared in Imprint, The Atlantic, and the Washington Post. Lange has also worked with the National Women's History Museum and curated exhibitions from the Boston Public Library's Leventhal Map Center. For the 2020 centennial of the 19th Amendment, she is curating exhibitions at the Massachusetts Historical Society and Harvard's Schlesinger Library. Thank you. Dr. Lange.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am so excited to be here today. Thank you all so much for organizing this. And the exhibition just looks fantastic. Unfortunately, I have not yet been able to see it yet, but trust me, I am plotting a way to get that on my calendar very soon. I think that we'll find in our in my presentation today and our conversation afterwards that there are a lot of connections between the materials that are currently on display and the content that I'll be discussing with you today. And so I'm really very thrilled and delighted to be here with all of you. And so as we go forward, what I would encourage you to do is if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat anytime. I will say that I don't see the chat while I have my share screen mode on, so I won't necessarily see it at the moment you post it, but I will be very excited to get to it when I'm done with my presentation. So feel free to put them there, and I promise we will get to them as quickly as we can. So today I am going to speak with you all about women's suffrage, and a lot of us don't use that term anymore. It is not a common 21st century phrase, but what it actually means is the right to vote. Suffrage just means the right to vote. It has nothing to do with women suffering, which is sometimes the answer I get from my students. It has everything to do with the ballot. And so in the 19th century, it was a very common word. People often talked about white male suffrage, black male suffrage around the conversations with the 15th Amendment. But for whatever reason, women's suffrage is the one phrase that has kind of stuck with us. And it really refers to this longer movement for women's voting rights and women's equality more generally, really. that really happened throughout the 19th century into 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And as we'll see, the passage of the 19th Amendment was not at all the end of the story for voting rights debates. And in the 19th Amendment itself, as you all probably know, did not, as some events say, guarantee the rights for women, the right to vote for women at all. We're still, even in 2020, having a lot of conversations about who should and can vote. So I'm excited to speak with you all today, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen so that we can work with some of these amazing images. And I'd like to start off with the ways that images of suffragists are still part of our visual culture, part of our society, which is something that I think you'll see more of in the exhibition, but these are mine. This is a photograph from the 2017 Women's March in Washington, DC. And those of you who are familiar with women's suffrage portraits might immediately recognize Susan B. Anthony. You might also notice Eleanor Roosevelt and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. These are women who are still kind of remembered, thought of as past women's rights leaders, and still used as part of political protest today. Another example I have for you guys that I've been noticing lately is perhaps some of you have heard of Inez Millholland. She was really a spokesperson of the suffrage movement, considered to be one of the most beautiful suffragists. She was one of the first women to earn a law degree from NYU. And she also was the herald, dressed in all white on a white horse, at the beginning of the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, DC, which was the first national parade, and really was something that made national news. And it couldn't help but recall but her photograph when earlier this summer, this photograph of Breonna Noble riding her horse for the Black Lives Matter protests in downtown Oakland. The similarities between these two pictures, these two very popular pictures are striking. There's something about women on horses, promoting a particular political protest that still feels compelling over a century later. And I even noticed in the last month that her image is being used to promote a product. So this image is no longer just about a political protest. It's kind of like advertising a consumer service as well, which I think is really interesting and says something about the ways that things are. The women's images are made not to only promote particular ideas, but also to promote, advertise particular things. Another image that I couldn't help but think of the suffragists with was the fact that, as you might know, suffragists were the first ever group in the nation's history to picket the White House. Which, if you've been into the White House, at some point in your life, you've probably noticed someone protesting something. And it seems, not surprising at all then that it became another site of protest this summer, with the writing of Black Lives Matter in the streets. And so I think that, we have another call back to the suffragists in the fact that the White House continues to be a really central site for political protest in 2020. And then, of course, we have one more example of suffrage imagery being part of our present moment, and that is with regard to the fact that a lot of women in power, a lot of women in politics, have been wearing white to things lately. It maybe all started with Hillary Clinton's choice to accept the Democratic nomination, wearing a white pantsuit, but we've seen a lot of women at various positions wearing white to recall the suffragists. And suffragists wore white in their parades, as you saw Inez Millholland doing. They did so perhaps to recall, images of purity and morality and things, but also because in the early 20th century, people were taking black and white photographs. White stands out a lot against a dark background. And then those photographs were being reprinted as halftones in newspapers, which not quite as high quality printing as we might have today. So in order to have them stand out in these protests, they wanted to wear white to really emphasize, to really make them more visible. And so over a century later, we actually have right now happening in 2020, a continued connection with the suffragists' visual strategies that, you know, publicity managers and suffrage leaders were talking about a century ago. And so what I'm hoping to really discuss with you all today is the fact that these debates about images, gender, and political power are very much rooted in the past, and that they are still happening today. We may do them, you know, participate in them in different ways. Maybe it's via Instagram or, you know, or other social media and that sort of thing, via television. But they are still happening with regard to gender and power. So I'm going to start much earlier than perhaps you might expect. I'm going to start in 1775. And this is, as you all know, the year before the Declaration of Independence. This is the early years of the rebellion. And this is a mezzotint, a very fine, very expensive print done by Philip Daw that imagines a scene in Edenton, North Carolina, where women are gathering to petition to boycott tea. And so Philip Daw, you know, this is a moment when there aren't that many fine artists in the United States, in the colonies rather. Philip Daw is in London. He probably read an article about this in a local newspaper, and he's never been to the colonies before. And you know, so he's just imagining what this looks like. And as you can see, it's not a flattering scene, right? This is not what women are supposed to be doing in the 18th century. We have a woman holding a gavel. She has these unattractive features, a large nose, you know, a double chin. Behind her is another woman who looks very masculine. Behind them, in the very back center of the room, we have a woman who is holding up a punch bowl. And if you know anything about 18th century punch bowls, they were not for like fruit punch. They were for alcohol. So this is a drunken scene. Another woman is like pushing the punch bowl back. We have women on the left side of the screen pouring out their tea canisters into this container. And all of these women are ignoring the child under the table. The only thing paying attention to the child under the table is the dog, who is also urinating on a tea canister, which is a surprisingly popular theme in 18th century caricatures. So this is a scene that you know, artist Philip Daw imagines what's happening in this rebellion. He imagines it's being led by women, that it's this scene of utter chaos, that women are taking on men's roles and therefore actually looking more masculine as they do it. The other really important detail in this image that I want us to notice is the Black woman who's holding a tray with a quill and an inkwell. And she is looking very eager to participate in this conversation and even sign the document as well. And so we know that, you know, 1775, North Carolina, she is supposed to represent an enslaved woman. So this is Philip Daw saying, not only is women participating in politics causing this chaos, causing this rebellion, but if women participate in politics, Black women and Black people in general will also want to participate in politics, which threatens not only the racial hierarchy, white supremacy, but also the entire economic system of slavery that the British Empire is built on in the 18th century. And so this is kind of one of those slippery slope arguments. You know, if we let women participate in politics, they're going to abandon their families and not care for their children. The social hierarchy will collapse, the economy will collapse. And this kind of imagery, this kind of argument, these themes, these visual tropes are some that you're going to see over and over again. Anti-women's rights advocates are surprisingly not very creative, even though female rights, advocates we'll see are constantly reinventing ways to increase women's power. So when we're looking at this image from 1851, so about 75 years after the previous image, this is a very different moment in time. By this time, women have been participating in anti-slavery movements. They've learned how to give lectures. They're learning how to run an organized movement, run a meeting, organize conventions, petition their state legislatures. All kinds of things have happened by 1851. One of the turning points is, of course, as you know, the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848. And this is the moment right after that is when we have the first national women's rights conventions happening in New England, in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850, 1851, there was another one there. And so this imagines, what these women's rights activists look like. It just so happened that this rise of women's rights activism coincided with this moment of new types of image technology. It's increasingly cheaper and easier to reproduce prints like this one for the masses by the 1850s. So we see a woman who's supposedly a women's rights leader. She is smoking in the center of the room, certainly not ladylike. In addition, she is wearing bloomers and exposing her ankle, which may not seem very scandalous to us in the 21st century, but in 1851 was remarkable and worth a comment, quite scandalous. She has her hand placed, I think fairly condescendingly on a man who is supposed to be her husband's head, and he is hunched over doing some needlework, mending some clothes. And in the front, we see that she is not paying attention to her crying child who says, "No more papa and mama," he's not being cared for. In the background, we have two women, and one is a white woman who I think is supposed to represent a domestic servant. She's holding a banner that says "No more master and kitchen, no more basement and kitchen," right? So she's protesting against her place as a worker. And then the other one is a woman, a Black woman, actually smoking a cigar, or a pipe rather, and she is protesting against slavery. So we have similar ideas about women's rights activism, right? That women's rights, that if women win rights, it will cause all of these other changes in society. And this served to make people laugh. This was supposed to be a funny cartoon in 1851. Because people would have seen it as absurd, as a joke. It was intended to undercut these reformers and make them look ridiculous. And so this is something that was very much popular in the 19th century. I'm going to show you just a few of these images, but it's an image, it's the type of image that people would have encountered over and over again in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, Harper's Weekly, in any number of magazines that they subscribed to. A lot of printers exchanged their engraving blocks and shared them with each other to keep the costs of creating new ones down. So these were just really part of American society. This is an image from 1851 as well. Also features women smoking, also features women wearing bloomers, not real bloomers, because the real bloomers that activists did wear actually went down to their ankles. Like the skirts were they were about as long as traditional skirts. Also shows a woman exposing her ankle here. One thing that this one shows that the other did not is two women linking arms. Kind of a suggestion of this idea that these women not only are forcing men out of their political roles, but also not requiring them in romantic relationships either. The only man in the scene is actually fleeing. He looks like he is just not happy to be there among these emancipated women. So this is a print from 1869 from Currier and Ives, a very popular lithography firm in 19th century America. If you've heard the Christmas song Sleigh Ride, you've thought of Currier and Ives before, whether you meant to or not. So this was a very inexpensive print that someone would have purchased, perhaps to hang in their home or to hang in a public space. This is The Age of Brass, or the Triumphs of Women's Rights. And one of the things that amuses me about this scene is the banner, the billboard in the front: "Vote for the celebrated man tamer, Susan Sharptongue." And one of the things, the big reason that resonates with me so much is I feel like that kind of rhetoric is still part of our popular conversations about women in power. And so that really stands out to me. Another component that's a little bit different and new about this one is that not only are these women ignoring their children, not at home caring for their children, but this woman on the right side is actually shaking her fist at her husband, telling him that he must care for the baby while she goes to vote. And as you can see, he is appalled and quite shocked and nervous about how he is going to do that. And this is another very popular theme in anti-women's rights images throughout the 19th century. So this print was made, a century after the first one I showed you. This is something that we'll see. These themes are things that we'll see over and over again. And so you can imagine why these suffragists are, desperate. They need to change the conversation. People have these stereotypes about suffrage leaders as masculine women, as women who are challenging gender norms, challenging traditional society, and that's not winning them over supporters. And so one of the first women's rights activists to circulate her portrait purposefully was Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth was born in the late 1790s. She was born in New York State. She was born into slavery and was enslaved until she was in her 30s. And after that, she became a fairly prominent women's rights and anti-slavery lecturer. She published her biography, she printed her portrait, and all of these things she did to promote her cause and to financially support herself. She was a working woman, and she needed the money she made as a reformer to live. And you can see in this photograph that she is telling us very specific things about herself. Unlike most people in the 19th century, Sojourner Truth actually copyrighted her own portrait, which was incredibly unusual. She wanted total control over the sale of her portrait. And so in this photograph, we see her seated, we see suggestions of a domestic scene. We see a vase of flowers, we see her knitting, we see a book. We also see her wearing very simple, not frilly, fashionable 19th century clothing. And this is to really emphasize that she's a respectable, dignified woman. She is not a frivolous person at all. At the bottom, we see the line, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." And in the 19th century, a shadow was a popular term for a photograph, because photographs were literally being made by exposing the glass plates to the sunlight. So it was a shadow. And it was supporting the substance, meaning herself, and the substantial reforms that she was representing. So she's distributing this portrait to challenge these sexist cartoons. She's also distributing this portrait to challenge racist cartoons that are mocking, satirizing not only Black women, but also Black men at this time. And so Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are starting to see by this time that these portraits are valuable. There are a lot of other activists. Frederick Douglass most famously distributes his portrait to challenge stereotypes. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton decide that they need to do this too, that this is an effective tool. So in 1870, they go to Napoleon Sereni's studio and sit for a session, and that's the photograph that we see here. And they don't have to kind of couch their leadership in domestic imagery in the way that Sojourner Truth does. They are pictured together, which is actually quite unusual. Normally, friends like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton would have taken portraits separately and exchanged them. That's, you know, the traditional practice of these carte de visite. But you can see them together, and that they are, you know, looking fairly aggressive as they watch us. You know, they are not looking like demure ladies. At this point, they are the leaders of the National Women's Suffrage Association, the first suffrage organization. And they've also just started the newspaper called The Revolution. So they are, they're very much eager to challenge the system. And of course, the imagery that's making fun of them actually stays the same. The one main thing that changes is that it's actually mocking specific identifiable women. So as you can see, this political cartoon from 1873 is specifically copying the photograph of Anthony from her 1870 session. But a lot of other things are very similar to the previous one. She has her hand on her hip in this kind of masculine pose, aggressive pose. She has her other hand, an umbrella that she's carrying, kind of like a military officer would carry a sword. Her clothes are incredibly inappropriate. Her skirt is far too short, and it's short to reveal not only these very masculine looking boots, but also, if you look closely, there are big spurs on her boots as well. In the background, we've got a political rally of women, which suffragists were not having political rallies in 1873, but this imagines what that would look like. A police woman is on the left, and two men are on the right. One is carrying a baby, and the other is carrying the day's groceries. And sometimes when I show this image to my students, they think that this is a feminist supporting image. It's imagining this feminist utopia or something in 1873. But we know from looking at the context of these historical images that this is intended to be mocking. This is a joke. This is something that, that people at the time would not have taken seriously, would have been an amusement. And the artist really takes it a step further. Susan B. Anthony had an eye issue, and she often sat for profile portraits so that she could hide it. But the artist, if you look closely in this image here, actually reproduced this disability that she had in this illustration. So, you know, he was not, he was making every attempt he could to really attack her. So suffragists have to keep working. They want to be portrayed the way we think of presidents, right? I mean, this kind of image of presidential candidates from 1880 is a type of portrait of a man in power that we're probably very familiar with today. Perhaps there are some on the walls of a museum. If they're not there, then they're at the walls of other museums and other universities. You've probably encountered them at some point in your life. And so they keep working. So in 1881, they published the first volume of a 6-volume series called The History of Woman Suffrage. And this is their attempt to tell the history of the suffrage movement from their perspective, include portraits of the women who they think are important. And they make sure that they resemble the portraits of people like presidents. And so they decided who was important. Obviously, they included themselves. They did not include any women of color. They didn't even include Sojourner Truth, despite the fact that Anthony actually had one of Sojourner Truth's portraits on hand. They didn't include any men. As you know, men are the ones who are voting. Men are the ones who are holding office. They need men's support, and men are actually significant advocates of women's suffrage in the movement, but men are not featured here. The book also really excludes suffragists who were in different organizations from them. So as you might know, if you're in the New England area, Lucy Stone, whose offices were in Boston, she headed the American Women's Suffrage Association, and she founded the Women's Journal. And the American Women's Suffrage Association was far larger than Anthony and Stanton's organization. And the Women's Journal was far larger, longer lasting, and, you know, had a greater readership than the revolution did either. But she's largely excluded from this story. So it tells a very particular story. And, you know, for better or for worse, you know, one of the benefits of it is that we have a lot of these women's portraits from this series available to us today in the archives. But it really skews the story that we're able to tell because we don't have a lot of access to other women's portraits today. Images of anti-women's rights activism remain similar. This is one of a man who's doing laundry while his wife is going off to ride her bicycle. He is supposed to have dinner for her and watch the children while she's gone. And in this time, suffragists shift from having individuals like Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony really working to create their own images of the movement to actually having an infrastructure within their organizations. So by 1890, the two main suffrage associations have joined. They have started press committees at the national level, as well as at the state and local levels. They have publicity committees. They're hiring publicity managers. They are also taking advantage of the fact that more women and more female artists are actually being professionally trained. And so while a lot of the images, all the images that I showed you previously were done by men, published by men, printed by men, we see a shift around the turn of the century to having more female artists. The National American Women's Suffrage Association actually creates its own publishing company in order to produce images like this one. This is by Blanche Ames. It's called Double the Power of the Home. 2 good votes are better than 1. And it shows a white woman holding her 3 children in this idealized home setting, right? Has a God bless our home sign. On the back, we've got a teapot, you know, steaming. And this is aiming to show readers who suffragists are fighting for the vote for, right? So it's a white woman. It's someone who is not required to work, so a fairly well-off woman. And this is intended to suggest that not only will women's votes not challenge the gender norms of the day and the race and white supremacy, it will reinforce these norms. You want these white women to vote. You want these women to become better mothers if they vote, because if they're better mothers, then they can do things like care for, you know, offer additional support for children's food, their health, their play, their schools. And so the idea is that women will become better mothers and caregivers if they have the vote. This is a direct counter argument to the century of anti-women's rights cartoons that we've been looking at. It becomes far less about women's equality and far more about reinforcing gender norms. This poster is done by Rose O'Neill. If you're familiar with the Cupid doll design, she also designed the Cupid doll. And this is a moment when the images of suffragists are shifting. So we see on one side this frumpy, unfashionable suffragist, and we see on the other hand a woman wearing, you know, an elegant hat and elegant shoes, looking like a beautiful, educated woman, not that dissimilar to the Gibson girl design ideal of this time period. And these images just aren't capturing the real diversity of the suffrage movement. It doesn't capture women like Mary Church Terrell, who was actually one of the first Black women to complete an undergraduate degree. And she went on to become the first president of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. And the National Association of Colored Women fought for women's votes, but they also fought for Black men's votes. As you know, in the 1890s, a lot of states, particularly in the South, passed new laws like literacy tests and poll taxes that were disenfranchising Black men. They were also seeing a rise of violence against Black people, and the NACW actually fought against lynching as well. So the National Association of Colored Women was formed in 1896 in part because white women-led suffrage organizations excluded them, didn't allow them to become leaders in the organizations, but also because Black women realized that they needed more than the vote. They needed to address a real range of issues in their communities in order to secure power. But Terrell was very interested in promoting her own image, much the same way Anthony and Truth were before her. And she was a very wealthy Black woman living in Washington, D.C., and she loved fashion. You can see in this image that this is from a program for one of her many talks, and she really resembles what was thought of as the idealized new Negro woman at the time. So she's very much emphasizing that she wants to appear elegant, respectable, refined, all of these things that will make her, a representative for her organization. And I want to shift forward back to that 1913 parade in Washington, D.C. Inez Millholland was one of the people who ensured that Black women were able to march as part of the parade. She made sure that Mary Church Terrell could march with Howard University, the Delta Sigma Thetas who were there, as well as Ida B. Wells, who marched with the Illinois delegation. I'm going to show you a racist cartoon just to give you a sense of why people like Terrell and Ida B. Wells were distributing their portraits. This is a portrait, a cartoon from 1913, which critiques both white suffragists and mocks Black suffragists at the time. So this white suffragist is horrified that these Black women want to support her cause. And in addition, the artist really offers a racist stereotype of these Black women with exaggerated features, unflattering clothing. They don't look like the Gibson girl or the new Negro woman ideal that suffrage leaders are really trying to associate with the movement. In fact, while all of the images I've shown you so far were very popular throughout the 19th and early 20th century, this is one of the only, quite frankly, piece of propaganda that emphasizes that Black women need to vote as good mothers, good members of the community that I ever found in the archives. And it shows a Black woman holding a bat labeled federal constitution, and she's beating down segregation, Jim Crow laws, grandfather clauses, and all in order to protect the children in her skirts. The title of this one is The South's Battalion of Death. It was published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and it envisioned what votes for women means to the South. A lot of Southerners were afraid that if the 19th Amendment passed, Black women would gain political power to do things exactly like the image suggests. So this was a really much more rare image. There weren't any propaganda images published by organizations like the National American Women's Suffrage Association that promoted the vote for women of color. The image that ultimately won out and the arguments that ultimately became part of popular conversations was this emphasis on women as caregivers, as patriotic citizens. And that's partially due to World War I, which the United States enters in 1917. The greatest mother in the world, is one who's caring for this soldier and caring for her nation. This is reinforced, as we all might guess, by the 1918 flu pandemic that follows in the fall. It's September 30th is the date that President Woodrow Wilson addresses the Senate and tells them to offer women the vote because they were such important parts of the war effort. But it's that week actually that the flu really comes to Washington, D.C. Many leading politicians fall ill. The House of Representatives is closed off to the public, and we've seen what happens when how a pandemic affects politics. And so it's not until the following spring that the Congress actually does pass the 19th Amendment and send it off to the states. We can imagine in the meantime that these women are stepping up as not only nurses, but also caregivers in their communities and their homes, really reinforcing that message here as well. And I wanted to just really quickly connect it to the exhibition that's on display that I'm so excited to see. Because these images that we were looking at are, very much part of the display, and you could see examples of some of these fantastic images, including this Rose O'Neill poster. I also love these suffrage maps, which were kind of these early versions of infographics, which are still so popular today. And you can see the ways that suffrage imagery really influences generations of artists after that, right? We see a woman here. I'm guessing this is Sojourner Truth, but I can't wait to kind of come and check it out for sure. And we can see the ways that the images of women's suffrage activism in the past is kind of still part of this conversation. These female identifying artists are drawing on this much longer tradition of women using art in order to advance ideas, advance equality, and that's really a very exciting thing. Before I kind of close out, I wanted to remind you to make sure that you've got your plan to vote. This is, one of the things I learned as I was doing this research is, just how powerful the vote is. If it weren't such an important thing, there wouldn't have been so many people organizing to prevent women from voting for so many years. So that's something that's really stood out to me as a result of my research. And if you're interested in finding out more about the book, I wanted to give this promotion code to you, which gives 20% off if you purchase through the University of Chicago Press website with the code UCPNEW. If you're interested in finding out more about these suffragists and images. So I am going to close this out, and I'm very excited to see what questions you all have for me this afternoon.
Hi, Dr. Lange.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Lisa Williams. I'm the Associate Curator at the New Britain Museum of American Art, and I just wanted to thank you so much for such a fascinating and compelling and timely lecture. As you know, I've read your book and found it absolutely fascinating, and I would recommend it to absolutely everyone who is tuning in today who enjoyed this lecture. I feel like this scratches the surface of what you can learn through your book, and I think your talk offered such a wonderful opportunity at close looking at these at this historical ephemera that really offers an opportunity to get a better sense for the attitudes that were present 100 years ago, and some of which still exist. So I wanted to just invite anybody who's tuning in now to share any questions. I also had a few myself that I hope you might entertain.
I'm open to it, yeah.
One of which is just, we at the New Britain Museum of American Art have been thinking so much about this landmark occasion, the centennial of women's suffrage in America, and increasing representation of women in the arts, in the workplace, beyond. Your research and your book are so incredibly timely and so informative. And so I'm just curious, and I'm sure other people are, how you came to this topic, given that there aren't many books out on this subject now, and it's just, it's so revealing of attitudes that still prevail, I think, and also offers a testament to all of the work that was done to achieve the advancements that have been gained. So more of a question, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is a project that I really came to through browsing the Library of Congress digital collections. If anyone's interested, if you look up women of protest in Library of Congress, if you just do a quick search for that, you will be able to see a collection of Library of Congress images, photographs in particular, that are of the National Women's Party picketing the White House. And when I was looking at those images, I couldn't help but wonder, why did they hire professional photographers to go one day to take their pictures there? Why did they protest the White House? I mean, when you're familiar with early 20th century imagery of women, you know that there aren't that many pictures of women protesting like this. And it just seemed like there was a lot more to learn about these images. One of the main points that I hope I make in my book and in my talk is that these illustrations are not, these photographs rather, are not just illustrations. They aren't just things that we can put in a book and say, oh, look, the National Women's Party picketed the White House. See, here's evidence. But when we look at them in broader conversations that are happening in newspapers and various forms of media at the time, we can understand how they're all in conversation with each other, that it's not just this one-off portrait or this one-off photograph of suffragists picketing. Those suffragists picketing were a direct conversation to, and a direct challenge to those images emphasizing motherhood and womanhood, and suffragists were very anxious about that. So that's one of the things that really brought me to this topic. And if you're interested more in those images, I would encourage you to check them out. They're freely accessible, which is really wonderful.
Amazing. And we have benefited so much from your research. So it's wonderful that it evolved in that way. And I think, I'm sure all those who are joining us today really also appreciate how you connect those historic images and that historic ephemera with the protests that are happening today, and making those juxtapositions that show how strongly in dialogue we are with the past, with these journeys. The journeys continue. And this is maybe a broad question, but in terms of visual campaigns, I'm curious how you might characterize the media associated with contemporary women's rights protests like the Women's March with historic suffrage marches. Do you feel that the messages are more unified or more disparate? Do you have kind of a sense or an opinion on how present efforts contrast with past?
Yeah, I think it's really complicated. In some ways, the coverage is very similar to what it was a century ago. I mean, there was that famous New York Times article that came out around the time of the Women's March that was, you know, like, what are the men going to do while the women are away? You know, what's going to happen here? And they very quickly backpedaled on that after seeing the backlash to it. But there are a lot of examples of that. And I also think that one difference between coverage of women's protests in the past and present is that, as we know, we're all often accessing news from particular places that are reinforcing our ideas, you know, whether it's social media or just like the channels that we prefer. And so unlike a century ago, where maybe a lot of people were reading more of the same newspapers, we're not getting that. We're getting very particular impressions of what's happening. And I think that's creating a very different type of media culture. So I think that what one person learned from the Women's March might not at all be what another person learned about the Women's March, which will present a real challenge for reception for visual culture scholars of the future. But I think that that's certainly part of it. I mean, we're seeing a lot of, I think that women's political campaigns have been really interesting to watch, to see how they choose to present themselves. Motherhood is still a major part of, you know, many female politicians, like Instagrams. You know, when Kamala Harris accepted the vice presidential nomination, she introduced herself as Mamala. You know, it's definitely thinking about a woman connected to motherhood is still, and caregiving in general is still something that people see as essential. Mm-hmm. So, and we still have this talk about women as man tamers, right? So I'm sure you remember the like Hillary Clinton nutcrackers that were created around the time of her presidential run. So I think it's shocking how similar some of these themes really are.
Yeah, it really is. I see we have a question that came in as well. One of today's attendees has asked, in your opinion, the current female political leaders who wear white to make a statement? Is the message they are trying to convey understood by the public and their male peers, in your opinion?
I think it is. If you do a quick Google search for women wearing white at the State of the Union for the past couple of years, or Hillary Clinton wearing white to accept the Democratic nomination, there was a lot of coverage of it after the nomination, and maybe it didn't reach everyone, right? But you know, to someone who's interested in history and suffrage, and you know, maybe reading a lot of publications geared at women in their 30s or something like that, it reached me very quickly and regularly. I think that one of the things it does is it recalls the fact that these women who are making political statements in the present have a longer history of women doing that in the United States. It really serves to legitimize their activism in a way that I find really compelling. Men, and you may not, and people may not have like caught this in the same way I have, but there were a lot of, when we were still doing things in person, there were a lot of men who wore yellow roses when the House of Representatives, for example, passed kind of a recognition act in 2019, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the House of Representatives passing the 19th Amendment, which I was actually able to go to, which was very cool. And you know, the minority leader of the House spoke, as well as the Speaker of the House, and both of them equally claimed this this long history of women in politics as something that they valued, and were wearing what, you know, Nancy Pelosi was wearing white, he was wearing a yellow rose, as were so many other people there. So I think that it does serve to really open up the conversation about women and politics in American history.
Wow, thank you. And understanding that you have not only written about this subject, but you've also contributed curatorially to exhibitions. Will you tell us a little bit about those projects?
I'd be happy to. All of them have digital components, so they're available to you if you're interested. They're all on my website, AllisonKLange.com, if you want to have a quick access to the link. But the Massachusetts Historical Society one was particularly focused on Massachusetts. And one of the really cool things about their collection was that they had a ton of anti-suffrage materials, which a lot of archives didn't collect. And so we have these like gorgeous suffrage posters, but not as much of the anti-suffrage materials. So we were able to actually really illustrate the ways that suffragists and their opponents were in conversation with each other. And actually a lot of the pro-suffrage materials they had were from the collections of the anti-suffragists who donated their collections. So you got like the sense of the fact that they were doing like opposition research in order to create their campaign, which is just really fascinating. The Schlesinger Library also has an exhibit up. It's called Seeing Citizens. It's not physically up, it's virtually up. And one of the things that's really interesting about collections is, you know, where strengths are and where we're lacking in those materials. And so that collection was founded by the National American Women's Suffrage Association after the 19th Amendment passed, but it really focuses on their propaganda. And so they don't even have much National Women's Party materials. They don't have any, don't have any National Association of Colored Women materials. And so it tells a very particular story. And we were able to use some reproductions for that one, but it gives you a sense of how collections really shape the stories that we can tell. And that's one of the reasons why I helped with a third digital exhibition, fully born digital exhibition, which was able to kind of pull images from all over to create a history of Black women in the suffrage movement. It's called Truth Be Told, and it was sponsored by Melinda Gates's charitable organization, Pivotal Ventures. And so that pulls in, you know, digital images. You can pull those in from anywhere to tell this history of Black women in the suffrage movement, which is you know, just a totally different curatorial experience choosing those and kind of telling that sort of story.
Mhm. And this is such a wonderful moment historically to be able to tell those stories that have not been included in the sort of major narrative, and to be able to celebrate the legacies of so many women who maybe were under-recognized at that time. So thank you for all that you're doing to contribute to this history and sharing it with the public and enlightening us. And I'm so looking forward to welcoming you to the museum, where I'd love to kind of get your insights and your thoughts as to how artists are also contributing to social change through the kind of work that they're doing, utilizing similar visual strategies as many of the members of the Women's Suffrage Party. So we look forward to welcoming you here. But in the meantime, we're just delighted and honored to have been able to benefit from your research today. I've learned so much. I want to just offer one last chance. If anybody wants to interject with a question, feel free to chat. Otherwise, I want to thank you again so much, Dr. Lange, and for all those who have joined us today. I would love to welcome you to visit Some Days Now, Women, Art and Social Change at the museum. The exhibition just opened on October 1st and will be on view through January 24th. We'll be offering a host of robust programs, both virtually, like today's talk, as well as on site. So do please keep an eye on our website for updates and additional programming information. I will share that in November, we will be hosting a virtual lecture performance and workshop by the Guerrilla Girls that will be very exciting. So stay tuned for more information. And in the meantime, thanks for everybody who joined us today. And thank you, Dr. Lange. And we hope to see you all at the New Britain Museum of American Art very soon.
I'd be delighted to. There's one more question in the chat that I'm happy to answer if we have
yes,
time. It says, you mentioned how your students see anti-women's suffrage illustrations as pro-feminist. How do you, as an educator, promote your students' modern viewing of art through a feminist lens while also training them to see and hear anti-suffrage dog whistles? And I think this is a really important question and a really tough question that I'm sure you, Lisa, also work with when you're working with anyone who comes in, because it's a matter of, I tell my students, you have to put your 19th century glasses on because if we approach them with the ideas that we have now, that women in politics, women in public spaces are not surprising, that women voting is like a non-event, then we don't see the same things. So I think that one of the things I do is really emphasize that 19th century Americans had a very different touch points, very different ways of thinking, and give them visual context. And I think that really aims to, the same way I did today, like gives them, if they see the broader story after I show them the first image and kind of force them to give me their initial thoughts, when they see the broader story, it becomes clearer. And so that's exactly the conversation. And I really appreciate that question. It's a very important one.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for the question. It was wonderful to be here today. It was a delight to chat with you all, and I can't wait to see the exhibition in person.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, and thanks to all who joined, and we'll see you again soon.